what evil lurks in the hearts of men. The shadow knows.
Perhaps some of you remember that old radio show, The Shadow. It was actually on the radio from 1930 till 1954. But even those of us who aren't old enough to remember the show know those opening words. It's an American classic. And if you've never seen it, or I should say heard it, the Shadow is a good guy. But in many ways, the Shadow is also a menacing character. He uses his menacing persona to fight crime. He uses his mystical powers for good, not evil. So the Shadow traveled to the Far East to learn mystical and psychic tricks and powers. And in fact, he learned this ability to make people's minds foggy so that they couldn't even see him, kind of invisibility mind trick. Like so many comic book heroes, the Shadow had a wealthy alter ego, kind of a convenient plot device for superheroes. The Shadow is actually a rich man named Lamont Cranston, but only he and his girlfriend know that he's the Shadow. So it was a simpler time, I suppose, in many ways, for some people, those radio show days. But the Shadow is a timeless character, or you could even say an archetypal character. He's a kind of prototype that shows up again and again in our lives and in the arts and in culture. So it's impossible to talk about archetypes or shadows, for that matter, without thinking of Carl Jung. Carl Jung, I spoke about just a couple of Sundays ago in a sermon on synchronicity. Carl Jung was that Swiss psychiatrist and the founder of analytical psychology. Jung created this whole notion of the shadow in the psychological sense. So our shadow, or our dark side, the shadow is that stuff, that part that each of us carries inside. Negative characteristics, envy, rage, lust, basically the 7 deadly sins and other foul traits are found in the shadow side. And that's about as far as the lay understanding of a shadow side or dark side goes. But Jung's concept of the shadow side was more complicated than that. This is, of course, just a sermon, and I am a minister, not a psychologist, so my explanation will still very much be at the lay level, but to take it just a little further. And some of this summary can be found in a great book called Introducing Jung by Maggie Hyde. So Jung wrote about the shadow and the ego together, 2 archetypes that are related. The ego is your personality number 1. It's that sense of purpose and identity that each of us has. It includes that persona, which is the personality that you show to the world. Personality number 2 is the shadow. The shadow includes animal-like qualities and undesirable traits, like I talked about, things that we try to hide, maybe even from ourselves. So it's sort of like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Dr. Jekyll is the ego, Mr. Hyde is the shadow. Personality 1, personality 2. According to Jung, to know yourself fully, you have to understand not just that ego and persona, personality number 1, but you have to understand your shadow as well to have full mental health. It can be dangerous if you're completely oblivious to your shadow side. Dangerous for yourself, maybe even sometimes for others. It can come out in times of duress, your shadow side, and so it's good to know what might be there. Jung wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, And the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the darker and denser it is. So in other words, the less aware you are of your shadow side, the greater its power over you. But though Jung acknowledged that examining the shadow is scary, he also wrote that the shadow is 90% pure gold. There are many wonderful things that we can tap into if we can become aware of and understand our shadow, if we can integrate our shadow. And some of you might know this is called shadow work in the biz of psychology. But it takes some work and some courage to do this work. What Jung knew was that not everything hidden in the shadow is bad per se. He knew that any part of our essence that we reject or repress is included in the shadow, and that's where a lot of that pure gold is. So in other words, perhaps deep down in your shadow side, along with some negative things or things we might think of as negative, perhaps also in your shadow side is something like you're incredibly creative. Perhaps the sort of person who might be able to paint beautifully. But somewhere along the way, you learn to reject and hide your creative self. But why would you reject and hide something positive about yourself? Well, we do this all the time. Somewhere along the way, probably when you were quite young, you learned an internal script and decided that being creative wasn't a good idea for you. Perhaps you had a traumatic experience from something in your family of origin. Perhaps you learned there that being creative wouldn't be safe for you or something like that. You learned an internal script that you can't make a living being creative, or you're not that talented. Try something practical. Things like that. And then without being even consciously aware of it, you put your creativity away or into your shadow box, as some have called it. So along with some negative traits, jealousy, sloth, what have you, you've rejected and tucked away some neutral or even positive things into this shadow side. Being out of touch with your shadow side can be dangerous when you're under extreme duress, but being out of touch with the rest of your shadow side can mean that you never nurture some of your talents, some of your strengths. It can mean that day after day, year after year, you're out of touch with some of your true abilities and potential. And you're not being all that you could be. What untapped potential lurks in the hidden hearts of humans? The shadow knows. So how can we do that shadow work or integrate those things hidden in our shadow side? Well, if you have the means and the access, financial and otherwise, you could see a Jungian psychologist. But the good news for everyone is that whether or not you have those means available to you, there are lots of books out there now and workshops and seminars available that are more affordable. So if you're motivated, you can do quite a bit of this work on your own. One of the shadow work experts is a woman named Debbie Ford, who wrote The Secret Side of the Shadow. She writes a lot about our internal scripts, our shadow beliefs. She writes that our shadow beliefs are the unconscious beliefs that control our thoughts, words, and behaviors. Our shadow beliefs establish our limits, but they also contain the very wisdom we need to transcend our current limitations, the things we need to get past our feelings of discontent in some cases. So many of the themes that show up in shadow beliefs are fairly predictable. Things like, I don't belong, I don't fit in, I'm a doormat, I'm unlovable, I can't trust anyone, and so on. And we keep running some sort of negative script like that over and over again in our minds. Not so much consciously often, but often almost subliminally, subconsciously. But if we do shadow work, we can start to pay attention. We can start to discover whatever those internal scripts might be for us, things that we tell ourselves. So I invite you to spend a little time in the upcoming days thinking about it. If you think about your life, perhaps especially some of your regrets in life, you might discover that there is a theme or that there are themes there. If you think about it, you might see that certain things you use, certain themes to explain stuff that happens to you. Maybe your theme is, I always have to take care of others. I never get to think of myself. Maybe your theme is, my shyness holds me back, or what have you. Once you recognize and realize those themes, you can start to notice them and get beyond them and the limits they're setting for you. It's easier said than done, of course. The devil we know is always less scary than the devil we don't know. And so getting beyond those internal scripts, no matter how harmful they are, is going to feel a little scary. If I've been telling myself all my life, subconsciously even, that I don't make friends easily, for instance, then that becomes actually part of my identity in a kind of way. And so it can feel scary to let go of it, like you're not yourself anymore. But as Ford writes, holding on to what we know is the biggest reason we remain stuck in our stories. Shadow beliefs have another aspect to them. Your shadow beliefs can perform other functions. I have a wise colleague with whom I did some shadow work. When one of my shadow beliefs revealed itself in our work, she didn't try to talk me out of it immediately. Instead, she would say and ask, how is that belief serving you? Because usually we use our shadow beliefs to protect ourselves in some way. If your internal script is, I can't make a living being creative, how is that belief serving you? Maybe that belief has protected you from, say, taking high-risk careers. Maybe it has protected you from the inevitable rejection and criticism that some of your creations would face. Maybe it's protected you from being ostracized by your family. And so before you throw away the shadow belief, it makes sense to pause and make sure you understand how that internal script has actually, in addition to holding back, been serving you in some way, to understand how that has functioned in your life. This time of year, I always think about, and I invariably watch, as I did just last night, one of the best stories of the shadow side in cinematic history, I would say. Do you have any idea what movie that might be? It's a Wonderful Life. Yeah. In many ways, the movie is syrupy sweet. It was even criticized when it came out in 1946 as Copra corn for the director Frank Capra. It was panned by some critics as really too corny. But though the movie, of course, does have some corny moments, I'm always struck by how dark it is in many ways. The movie tells the story of George Bailey, played by Jimmy Stewart, in his small-town life in Bedford Falls. And on the surface, George Bailey and Bedford Falls are old-fashioned and terribly decent. That's personality one of Bailey and Bedford Falls. So that's the ego, the persona. But George Bailey and Bedford Falls both also have personality number two, the shadow side. Bedford Falls, after all, is constantly under the thumb of that nasty Mr. Potter, played by Lionel Barrymore, the richest, meanest man in town. And George Bailey, he's a great guy. Everybody loves him. But really, he's a tormented soul. What's his shadow script? Something like, I'm stuck here taking care of my family and friends, stuck in this 2-bit town, stuck with this measly old building alone. And there's this real rage inside him that he hides or tries to hide. But the bitterness is just below the surface with him the entire movie. And at the end of the movie, this is a spoiler alert, but you have had 72 years to watch I'm covering my children. Yes. At the end of the movie, George Bailey has what we might call a nervous breakdown. The Bailey building and loan is missing $8,000. Imagine how much money that would have been back then. And he's going to take the fall for it, even though it wasn't his fault. It was the fault of that inept Uncle Billy and, of course, Mr. Potter. At the end of the movie, it's Christmas Eve, which is the whole reason it's a Christmas movie. It ends on Christmas Eve. And the police are coming to arrest George. So George is, of course, just totally beside himself. He picks a fight with his wife and his kids. He goes out and gets drunk. It's out of character for him, at least personality number 1. But under extreme duress, personality number 2 came out. In fact, in his most difficult moment, he's thinking of killing himself. But then his guardian angel, the lovable Clarence, appears. And what happens next is, of course, a brilliant retelling of A Christmas Carol, but in reverse. A Christmas Carol has the nasty Ebenezer Scrooge shown ghosts who show him all the wrong he has done in his lifetime, all the negative ways he's impacted the world and the people around him. But in It's a Wonderful Life, in reverse, Clarence the angel has this brilliant idea to let George see what Bedford Falls would be like if he had never been born. So George sees what the town would be like and his family and his friends. And of course, it was pretty horrible without him being around. His family wasn't the same. Bedford Falls, people were living in horrible circumstances. Potter owns the entire town, you name it. And Clarence says, "You see, George, you've really had a wonderful life." Debbie Ford asks, how would your life look if seen through the eyes of an angel? That's exactly the gift that George Bailey is given in the movie. Sometimes, if we could see our lives through the eyes of an angel, if we could see the story of our life with all of its imperfections through a gentle set of eyes, we might see that we've really had a wonderful life too. We need to tell ourselves different stories about our lives. And that's the question I want to leave you with for today. What would your life look like if seen through the eyes of an angel? Just as Bedford Falls has a shadow side, so does the town of Littleton, so do all the surrounding towns and cities, and so does this congregation, just as all congregations have a shadow side. So another thing we can ponder together as the year goes on are what are our shadow beliefs here about this congregation? What's the collective internal story we might be telling ourselves? What hidden gifts do we have? And how has it been serving us as a congregation to hold ourselves back by holding on to those shadow beliefs? How would this congregation look through the eyes of an angel? Please remember that your shadow side and our shadow side includes good things along with the bad. Please remember that indeed without light there are no shadows. Or as Carl Jung put it, it's only at night that no shadows exist. May we have the courage to explore our shadow sides together. May we find there pure gold. May it be so. Blessed be, and amen.